Welcome everyone. In this video, we're going to talk through my take on the deck power rankings of the Vibe TCG. Season 0 just ended, and so this is a good time to kind of take a snapshot on the various decks that are popular on the ladder to kind of understand how they rank up next to each other. The way this video is going to work is I'm going to put all the decks that are popular onto this chart in their various categories, with S being the strongest and D being the weakest. Then I'm going to also present a deck list for most of the decks. The deck lists presented are sourced from the community, and they generally come from people who are very, very good at playing those respective decks. One thing to keep in mind is that to be successful with a deck, you can't just take a deck list that you found on the internet somewhere, load it into the game, and just play it. It's really a process of adjusting that deck list to your own play style, because certain cards, if you don't understand why they're in the deck, or if your play style doesn't work with that card, you'll want to swap it and modify it to your own play style. So you should really think about these deck lists as a starting point, and then you kind of just go from there, developing it yourself, learning how the deck works, modifying it. That's really the path that I found that has led me to be a successful Vibes player. One other thing to note is right now we don't really have a great data-driven framework for assessing the power rankings of different decks. So this means that a lot of this video is based on my own intuition and feeling. So if you disagree with how I've ranked the decks, or if you disagree of how I've categorized the decks, or if you think I've missed a deck, please let me know in the comments or find me on the Vibes Discord. I want to keep maintaining this over time. And so as the metagame develops, to keep you all informed of kind of how things are. So your feedback is greatly appreciated, and it's really going to make the content better. The first deck that I'm putting down in the D tier is the modified yellow starter deck. So this deck is not really even a real deck. What it is you basically, when you start the game, you can get the yellow starter deck very easily, and it's very powerful relatively to just a random collection of cards. And so for new players with limited collections, a lot of them end up playing with the yellow starter deck, and then they kind of add cards as they open them. There's no set list for this deck because it really is a function of what cards people open in order to make it better. So I'm not going to have a deck list for this, but I have made a series of videos, which I'm going to link down below, which is all about taking the yellow starter deck and modifying it as you open additional cards and kind of trying to mimic the path of that new player. So overall, this deck is this like kind of mid-rangey deck that really aims to win the game by kind of taking over by playing like large extrovert penguins and shy penguins and kind of just steamrolling your opponent in the mid game. Now, one of the big weaknesses of this deck is right removal and board clear are really difficult for it to deal with, which is what a lot of the higher caliber decks run. But against unrefined deck lists in the lower stages of the ladder, it's super strong. The next deck is what I will call the modified red starter deck. It's basically the same concept as a modified yellow starter deck, but I think it's a much stronger deck because it's way more dynamic with how it plays. I've also created a video series about developing this deck to mimic the path of a new player. So I'm going to put that down in the description as well. So the modified starter deck is this kind of like mid-rangey red deck. It's super, super strong into the modified yellow starter deck as well. And so that's one thing, because the modified yellow starter deck is so popular, that really gives this deck the edge. If you're a new player, I really suggest starting with the yellow starter deck and then moving to the red starter deck. It also is a very different play style. So by using it, by learning both of these decks, you really get a lot of fundamentals with how the game works. All right, so now we're going to get into our first real deck. And by real deck, I mean a deck that's really built with the concept of you have access to every card. And so that's going to be the yellow YumYum deck. Now this deck is called YumYum because it's based around the YumYum card, which is a card that says 4/5 yellow pudge, you ice all penguins. So this is kind of this like yellow control deck, and it is really, really good into the modified yellow starter deck. When looking for a yellow YumYum list, I reached out to Micah because Micah is a highly rated dummy thick player who almost exclusively plays yellow YumYum whenever he's trying to play competitively. So when we look at his deck list right here, you can see the synergies that this deck is trying to do. So at its core is a combination of YumYum, which is that board clear we already talked about, with Penguin Who Doesn't Mind Goodbyes. So Penguin Who Doesn't Mind Goodbyes Basically says whenever yellow penguin is iced, draw a card. So you have that on the board, you play YumYum, you have a bunch of penguins, you draw a bunch of cards. Then there's also synergies like LuckyPenguin. Whenever that gets iced, you get a penguin back onto the field. You have DaydreamingPenguin, which is a kind of a removal spell that also activates Penguin Who Doesn't Mind Goodbyes. You have YellowMegaPenguin, which is another way to ice your own penguins for value. Bunkus is in there for protection against getting iced out of your deck, just because this deck can draw a lot of cards. And then there's obviously the removal package and BuddyUp as a finisher. So again, so this is Micah's list, and yeah, so if you're looking to play yellow YumYum, this might be a good starting point to start building from. I also have made a deck guide for the yellow YumYum deck, which I'm going to link to in the description. My list is a little different than Micah's, but I think between these two lists, you'll definitely get a good feel for the deck and figure out how to best build it for your own playstyle. The next deck, which is in the C power level, is the yellow aggro deck. This deck is very near and dear to my heart because it's the first deck that I ever built in Vibes. And it's a super, super strong deck for laddering up to Dummy Thick because it has very fast games and it has very, very straightforward, consistent game plan. So let's take a look at the deck list. All right, so here's the list for the yellow aggressive deck. So the way that this deck works is you basically have a few key elements to it. You play a bunch of small penguins that then you use to create Pudge to draw cards, which is through PrepareforaWildNight and ChecktheYellowPages. And then you have removal in terms of DaydreamingPenguin, NotYourKeys, and GotEm. And then you close out the game with Put Your Flippers in the Air or BuddyUp. Overall, this deck, yeah, has a really straightforward game plan, but it is very strong unless you're running into opponents who play board clears, in which case you're in a lot of trouble. So I've also created a deck guide for this video, so I'm going to link that in the description as well. And if you're a newer player, another really nice thing about this deck is that it runs very few expensive cards. The only additional rares are GotEm, which is completely optional. You can just replace that with just put in another BuddyUp, 2 more Penguin of the Falling Leaves, and 1 Put Your Flippers in the Air. And then there's Penguin Who Might Bring a +1, but you can also just put in Mysterious Penguin in that slot. So this is a really nice beginner friendly deck of the properly built decks. The next deck we're going to talk about is the green Mega Caffeine deck. So at this point, we've now gone up from the C tier into the B tier. So these decks are really getting one level up in the power level. So the green Mega Caffeine deck is extremely strong if it draws correctly. And it can also have very fast games. So it's pretty good for laddering. The one downside with this deck is because it doesn't play any action cards besides some saucy rods, it's very easy for your opponent to play around. So it's very strong, but if they know what's coming and have teched their deck accordingly, because the game plan is so linear, it can be easily countered. So I think it's good against a general wide range of decks on the ladder. But in a tournament setting, I think you're going to struggle with this deck just because everyone will kind of know how to play around it. But let's take a look at the list. So the list we're going to be using is the one from Barbecue, who placed top 8 with this last season. So the core setup of the deck is you're basically using the combo of Too Much Caffeine with Green Mega Penguin, because that basically allows you, Too Much Caffeine says at the start of action time, each player may choose a penguin and flop it, but then Green Mega Penguin can't be targeted by anything, so your opponent can't actually flop it. Then you combine that with a bunch of buff cards like Inspiring Story, and then you also have Sliding Penguin, and then you also have the Popcorn Penguin removal package in there. This is all then surrounded with a bunch of tech cards, but because it's kind of a colorless deck where you're playing cards of all sorts of different colors, there's actually no action cards in it, besides GotEm and WhataTwist, but those actually don't require Pudge. Barbecue's list is really interesting because he also goes in the direction of adding Hungry Penguin and Blue Swordsman as kind of like an alternative late game win condition. And then, of course, there's Misplaced to try to deal with Bismo, which is just a really tough matchup for this deck. So overall, this is the list. I've also created a deck guide for this archetype. my deck list is also a little different. It's definitely more of the standard, straightforward ladder build, whereas barbecues, I think, is more optimized for the top end of the ladder, where you really have high level players that you need to just not do the simple game plan, but really kind of like optimize around other high skilled players. The next deck is my favorite deck in all of Vibes. So that's the Purple Recycler deck. This was one of the first decks that I ever created, and it is just this like mid-rangey purple tempo deck. Personally, I have a lot of success with it, but really no one else plays it besides me, which makes me question if it's really that good or not. But I'm very successful with it, and so let's jump in and take a look at the list. Yeah, so here's the deck list for the Purple Recycler deck, and I've also created a deck guide for this, so I'm gonna link that in the description as well. Overall, the concept of this deck is you just play a lot of small purple minions. Then you have a lot of removal. You have actually have a philosophical debate, adventure squad, GotEm, as well as phosphorus penguin. So you kind of just chip at the opponent's board, removing all their things. You then also have penguin who's okay and brainy penguin to fill up your ice. And after you have all that kind of together, you draw a lot of cards as well with change perspective and chase your dreams. And then you close out the game with a bunkus. So it's just like mid-rangey tempo deck, very strong against certain types of decks, like anything with a few large penguins. However, it does struggle against Popcorn Penguin, which is very rampant on the ladder, just because a lot of people are playing Popcorn Penguin in order to deal with the yellow starter deck. So overall, it's also a very flexible dynamic deck. So if you're looking for a little more complicated deck to play and you really like the idea of having a lot of value in your deck, this is definitely a deck to try out. The next deck in our list for the B tier is the Blue Mill deck. So this deck really focuses on icing your opponent, and it can have some very polarizing matchups, which can make it great for when you're thinking about kind of playing a tournament. And on the ladder as well, depending on what type of decks you're running into a lot, it can be really good for that as well. So the list we'll be using for the Blue Mill deck is the one from Caution Fun. So Caution Fun, there was an in-person tournament at the Vibes headquarters, and Caution Fun brought a slightly modified version of this deck. After the tournament, he changed it a little bit. So this is the updated list, and ended up placing second place in that tournament. It's a very, yeah, like I said before, it's also one of those decks that's very dynamic and has a lot of flexibility. And so overall, if you're looking for a more kind of complicated off meta type of choice, I would definitely recommend trying out to build your kind of own version of the Blue Mill concept. The next deck that we're going to put in the B tier is Green Control. So this deck also is not played very often, but it can have really powerful results if piloted correctly. It also is one of those decks that, depending on what the metagame is, can adjust really well to it. For the green control list, we're also going to use the list provided by Caution Fun. Caution also previously made a deck guide for this video, so I'm going to link that down in the description as well. Now, I think that deck guide was a slightly outdated version of this deck, so there's been a few updates for it, but that's going to be with all the deck guides that I've posted throughout this video. So overall, this deck is definitely based on just slowly playing out your penguins, and then it has a bunch of win conditions. So you can either do everyone stay clam with WhataTwist, or you can use Luca saves a penguin, or you can actually use coin penguin with some buff cards. So you'll notice with a lot of the top decks, barbecue, like the list from barbecue for the caffeine deck, or this deck, and you'll see some of the ones later. A lot of them run this like popcorn penguin inspiring story package, and the reason for that is just it's so strong against the general ladder because of all the yellow decks, as well as it does really well against BizBunk, which we'll get to later in the tier list as well. So yeah, so if you're looking for a more kind of slow, control-y type build, green control is definitely something to check out. That does it for the B tier. So let's move on to the A tier decks. So the first deck I'm going to put on here is the red Mega Midrange deck. This is a deck that's not played very much, but personally, I just think it's super, super powerful. And it's basically the modified red starter deck, but it's really built on having the red Mega Penguin engine driving the deck. So let's take a look at the deck list. So the deck list we're using for this is the one that Spencer used in order to win that in-person tournament that I was talking about, where Caution Fund brought that blue mill list. So Spencer's red mega mid-range list is very similar to the one that I made a deck guide for earlier, which I'm going to link below. However, it's been updated to really deal with the modern metagame, specifically bringing in WhataTwist and Screaming Penguin in order to handle the green caffeine mega deck. So overall, the way that this deck works is there's just a lot of complicated interactions you can do with all the action cards. And then you combine that where you have a red Mega Penguin, which is just a card advantage engine. So this deck, I would say, is probably the most difficult deck to play in all of Vibes. So it's definitely not for beginners, but it's extremely powerful and has a really high ceiling because of all of the like nuanced little interactions you can do. And on top of that, there's a lot of elements of how do you say this? Of On top of that, there's a lot of mind games you can play with this deck because it's really about reacting to what your opponent does. So one other thing with Spencer is he did not place that high on the leaderboard, but that's because he's the founder of Vibes and therefore is not really participating in the full competition. But yeah, on that tournament, right, he won with it. He's very good with it, and it's a super strong deck. The next deck in the A tier is what I'm going to call the mid-range BizBunk deck. And so BizBunk is basically this concept where you combine Bunkus with Bismo. And Bismo basically says whenever Bismo enters your huddle, if you have no cards in your deck, win the game. And there are two different builds of the BizBunk concept. And so the mid-range BizBunk is really more about taking a slightly slower approach to the game and controlling the game a little bit. So this deck is super powerful, and of the top 8 players, 2 of them use this deck in order to place in the top 8. And so, so let's take a look at the list. So the list that we're going to be looking at is Top Hat Panda Magicians, a mid-range BizBunk. So as you can see, it's really built around having that Bismo Bunkus combo. But this deck also has a lot of like removal spells in it. It has some inspiring stories. It has like Unmasked Penguin for a little more of a mid game. So it's really not just 100% in on that combo, but it really gives it a lot more flexibility in order to adapt to the type of deck you're playing against. That being said, it's extremely powerful, and the fact that, 2 of the top 8 players were pretty much primarily playing this deck all the way to the last half of the season just shows it's just raw power level. The next deck in our A tier is the green aggro deck. So this deck is very similar to the green mega caffeine deck, but because it's not all in on just this multicolored, not having actions kind of approach, it has a lot more flexibility. On top of that, it has just a extremely strong matchup into the caffeine deck. So if you're kind of wanting to play the like aggressive green type approach, I personally think the green aggro deck is stronger than the green mega caffeine deck, but it also is going to be dependent on what the meta is. For this deck, we're going to be using the deck list of Dropout. Dropout also placed top 8, I think even top 4 with this deck, and also just had an extremely powerful run at the end of the season. So basically, it's very similar to the other green aggressive decks or even the green control, where we have that like Popcorn Penguin inspiring story combo in there. However, this relies a lot more on just having green penguins that are buffing each other. And then you also have some finishers in terms of Cleanup Good and Hungry Penguin. Now, I've also created a deck guide for this list, so I'm going to link that down in the description as well. So my list is definitely not as refined as Dropouts. It was kind of more of an early stab at this deck. So I think for the current meta, Dropouts is definitely more appropriate. And so if you're looking for fast ladder games and a deck that has more flexibility than some of the other aggressive decks and more ability to recover from board clears, then I think the green aggro is the deck for you. And of all these types of decks, this is definitely the one that I would recommend playing. But again, it really goes down to your play style, what you want to play, and what decks you're comfortable with. That does it for the A tier. So now let's get to the S tier. So right now, there's only a single deck in the S tier, and I think this is by far the strongest deck right now, and that is the Cycle BizBunk deck. If you look at the top 8, there were 2 players that were primarily playing Cycle BizBunk, and the person who I think is the strongest ladder player, who's Umu, they were also playing this deck. So let's take a look at Umu's list. So this is Umu's Cycle BizBunk list. And so the difference between this and that mid-range BizBunk is this deck is just all in on getting to the Bismo win condition as quickly as possible. And it really just doesn't even try to, there's no removal in it besides GotEm. And it's really just about like, you're just going to race to that finish condition. This deck really can high roll like crazy. And so if you have the right hand, it's really hard to beat it. It also really just focuses on all the auxiliary cards, like the Mega Penguin or the NotYourKeys anymore, are all just focused on protecting your like key pieces of the combo. So I've been starting to play with this deck as well. I have a slightly different list, but it's it's just so powerful on the ladder. So overall, I would if you're looking for a slightly more complicated deck, but a deck that just has a really high power level and it can just have a really high ceiling in terms of its just overall average performance, I would pick this. So that's a conclusion of all the decks that are currently popular slash strong on the ladder. I think one thing I will say, just again as a caveat, is I looked at all this in the context of climbing the ladder. I think if we were going to play for a tournament, I would probably not pick Cycle BizBunk as the deck, just because again, it is also a little more on the linear game plan side. So I think like from that perspective, I think the like red Mega Penguin or mid-range BizBunk, maybe blue mill or green control are probably the best tournament decks of this list. But in terms of just quickly climbing up the ladder, I think this is kind of how I would approach it. So again, so thanks everyone for watching. If you have any comments or feedbacks, please let me know. I know this is a video that has a lot of my own opinions in it, and I definitely want to hear where you think that I could be doing a better job. And yeah, so I will keep watching the metagame as it develops, and I'll probably be shipping an update video to this once there's been significant changes. All right, until next time, thanks everyone.